When did you prove the haters wrong? My 11th Christmas almost became my last. I was reaching for my stocking when the shaking started. Careful, Herbert, Mom said sharply, not even looking up from where she was filming baby Livy. That carpet is new. I think my blood sugar is low, I said, trying to steady my hands. I'm really shaky. Of course you do, Dad sighed. It's Christmas morning. Some stray kids just can't handle excitement. I'd been adopted when I was 11. This was my 3rd Christmas with the Peef family. For the first 6 months, I was their miracle, the beautiful child they thought they'd never have, until Mom got pregnant with Livy. Then she had Robert 9 months later. Suddenly, I wasn't a miracle anymore. I was a mistake. Can I please have some juice? I asked. I feel like I'm about to faint. You just spilled it everywhere, Aunt Daniela interrupted. Maybe if you were more careful. He's always clumsy, my cousin Cian offered. Mom says it's probably genetic. Genetic. Everything wrong with me was genetic, now. The shaking was getting worse. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead even though the house was 40 degrees. I really just need my glucose meter, I said, standing up. Sit down, Grandma Peef commanded. We're about to open presents. You can test after like everyone else does things, after family time. But my mom said I have to test if I feel... Your mother had said a lot of things. Grandma cut me off, glancing at my adoptive mom. Frankly, I think she babied you. In my day, children didn't have all these conditions. That's probably the reason why she gave you up in the first place. It's not fake, I whispered. Nobody said it was fake, Uncle Gus laughed. Just convenient. You've been sick for every holiday since Livy was born. That wasn't true. I'd had strep throat once. One time. Look, Dad said, clearly exhausted. Just sit down quietly for 30 minutes. That's all we ask. 30 minutes of normal family time. Normal family. I wasn't normal family anymore. The adoption certificate on the wall had been replaced with Livy's hospital photo. My baby pictures, the few they had from foster care, were moved to the basement. 7-year-old Robert looked at me from across the room. Unlike baby Livy, he was old enough to understand something was wrong. Herbert's all sweaty, he announced. He's fine, Mom said, adjusting the camera angle on Livy. Some people just sweat more. Probably how his birth family was. My vision started to blur. I blinked hard, trying to focus. I really need... The words came out slurred. Are you mocking me? Grandma Peef stood up. Speaking gibberish to get attention? He's probably on drugs, Aunt Daniela whispered loudly. You know what they say about birth mothers. I'm not on drugs, I tried to shout, but it came out garbled. My tongue felt thick. This is exactly what the social worker warned us about, Mom said to Dad. Behavioral issues manifesting in adolescence. His mom was probably a junkie, Cian said matter-of-factly. That's why he's all messed up. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. With the last bit of strength I had, I stumbled toward the kitchen. Where do you think you're going? Dad grabbed my arm. I yanked free, harder than either of us expected. He stumbled backward. Don't you touch him! Grandma shrieked. I crashed into the counter, grabbing the landline phone. Put that down! Mom screamed. No, I slurred while dialing 911. They could ground me forever. They could send me back to foster care. I didn't care anymore. I'm taking that phone, Uncle Gus stood up. Touch me and I'll tell them everything, I managed to say. How you knew I was diabetic. How you wouldn't let me test. Everything. The phone rang once, twice. 911, what's your emergency? I am diabetic. I gasped into the phone. Blood sugar. They won't let me test myself. Dad lunged for the phone. I fell backward, taking it with me, shouting our address as I hit the ground. Sir? Sir, are you there? The operator's voice called out. He's faking! Aunt Daniela yelled. He's just acting out! But I wasn't acting. My body started convulsing, real seizures taking over. The last thing I heard was the operator's voice. We have units responding. Possible diabetic emergency with family interference. Sending police backup. I woke up in the ICU. The doctor said another 10 minutes and I could have had permanent brain damage. Or died. The hospital social worker had a recording of the 911 call. Every word. Including the family yelling that I was faking while I seized on the floor. Dad kept saying, we thought he was being dramatic, while Mom cried about not knowing his genetics. But I knew the truth. And now, so did everyone else. The beeping wouldn't stop. I tried to open my eyes, but the lights above me were too bright, making everything look white and blurry. My throat felt dry and scratchy. I reached up to rub my face and felt something taped to my hand. An IV line. The smell of disinfectant hit me hard. Hospital. I was in a hospital. My head turned to the side, and I saw monitors showing numbers I didn't understand, lines moving up and down across screens. The Christmas morning memories came flooding back all at once. The shaking. Mom filming Livy instead of looking at me. Dad grabbing my arm. The phone falling. My body shaking on the floor while everyone screamed I was faking. I tried to sit up, but my arms felt weak. A nurse walked in and saw me moving. She pressed a button on the wall and checked the monitors. Within minutes, a doctor came in carrying a tablet. He pulled a chair next to my bed and sat down, which seemed weird since doctors usually stood. He showed me the tablet screen with a bunch of charts and graphs. My blood sugar had dropped to 28 when the paramedics got there. Normal was between 70 and 120. He pointed to a red line that showed how low it went. He explained that at 28, my brain wasn't getting enough glucose to work right. That's why I couldn't talk clearly and why I had the seizure. He scrolled to another chart showing timeline marks. The paramedics gave me glucose through an IV at 9:47 a.m. If they'd gotten there at 10 instead, I might have had permanent brain damage. My stomach felt sick when I realized my family wanted me to wait 30 minutes for presents. 30 minutes would have been too late. The doctor kept talking about ketones and A1C levels, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could think about was how close I came to dying while my family opened Christmas presents. A man in a suit walked in carrying a tablet. He introduced himself as Silas Bradshaw from the hospital social services. He sat in another chair and asked if I felt okay to listen to something important. I nodded. He tapped the screen, and suddenly I heard the 911 operator's voice from Christmas morning. Then my own voice, slurred and desperate, trying to give our address. In the background, clear as day, Aunt Daniela yelling that I was faking, Mom saying something about behavioral issues, Uncle Gus threatening to take the phone. The recording kept going even after I stopped talking. You could hear the thud when I hit the floor. The operator asking if anyone there knew CPR. My family still insisting I was acting out for attention. Silas paused the recording and looked at me. He said this was evidence of medical neglect, and they were opening an investigation. My hands started shaking again, but this time from fear, not low blood sugar. The next morning, Dad showed up at my room. I heard him before I saw him, talking loudly to the nurses at their station about my supposed behavioral problems. He kept saying I'd been acting out since the biological kids were born. The charge nurse, a woman with short gray hair, walked him to my door but blocked him from coming all the way in. She told him visiting hours were limited, and all visits would be supervised. Dad's face turned red. He tried to argue, but she held up her hand and pointed to a security guard standing near the elevator. Dad could visit for 15 minutes with a nurse present, or he could leave. Those were his options. He chose to stay but spent the whole time telling me how disappointed he was in my choices. The nurse took notes on everything he said. The next morning, a different man showed up. Roland Cartwright from CPS. He had a folder thick with papers and a kind face that reminded me of my 4th grade teacher. He explained that the hospital had reported what happened, and CPS was investigating. He said I couldn't go home right now. They needed to make sure I'd be safe before I could go back. The word if hung in the air, even though he didn't say it. He asked me questions about my medical care at home. When was the last time I'd seen my endocrinologist? How often I checked my blood sugar? Whether I always had access to my supplies. I told him everything. About the missed appointments. The times Mom said we didn't have money for test strips even though she bought new clothes for Livy. How they kept my insulin in their bedroom, so I couldn't waste it. Roland wrote everything down without commenting, but I saw his jaw tighten when I mentioned the insulin being locked up. That first night alone in the ICU was the scariest and safest I'd felt in months. The nurses checked on me every hour, but I still tested my blood sugar myself every time I woke up. The meter was right there on the table next to me. No one told me I was being dramatic when I used it. No one rolled their eyes when the number came back low. I tested at midnight, at 2 a.m., at 4 a.m. Each time I wrote the number down on a napkin because I didn't have paper. The numbers stayed steady all night thanks to the IV. The next day, the endocrinologist came. She was younger than I expected, with curly hair pulled back in a ponytail. She pulled up my medical records on her computer, and her eyes got wide. My A1C was 11.2, which meant my average blood sugar had been over 280 for months. She showed me the target range was under 7.5 for kids my age. She asked when I'd last adjusted my insulin doses. I couldn't remember. Mom always said I was using too much and cut back my doses without telling the doctor. The endocrinologist started explaining how to calculate insulin based on what I ate. She taught me about carb ratios and correction factors, things my parents never let me learn because they said I'd mess it up. She wrote out a new insulin schedule and made me practice the math until I got it right. The nurse brought me a small notebook and a pen. I started writing down everything. Blood sugar numbers, what I ate, how much insulin I took, how I felt. Each entry got its own line with the time and date. Having it all written down made me feel less scared. I could see patterns. I could prove I wasn't making things up. The numbers didn't lie even when everyone else did. 3 days later, Roland came back. He said they'd found an emergency foster placement with someone named Gail Cartwright. She was a retired nurse who'd fostered diabetic kids before. She lived 20 minutes from my school so I wouldn't have to transfer. He said it was temporary while they investigated, but the way he said temporary made it sound like it might be a long time. I was scared, but anything sounded better than going back to people who almost let me die. Gail picked me up from the hospital in an old minivan. She was short, with brown hair streaked with gray, and wore scrubs even though she wasn't working. The first thing she did was hand me a juice box and a bag of crackers. She said we'd stop at the pharmacy on the way home to fill my prescriptions. At her house, she gave me a tour focused entirely on medical stuff. She showed me the kitchen drawer full of glucose tablets and fruit snacks. The juice boxes in the pantry, the fridge, and a mini fridge in the hallway. She'd put glucagon kits in 3 different rooms with my name labeled on them. She showed me my bedroom, a small room with blue walls and a twin bed. On the nightstand was a basket with test strips, lancets, alcohol wipes, and a new glucose meter still in its box. She said I could test whenever I needed to without asking permission. She said it 3 times like she wanted to make sure I heard her. That night at dinner, she watched me test and calculate my insulin dose. She didn't comment except to nod when I got the math right. When I woke up at 2 a.m. with my blood sugar at 65, she was already in the kitchen getting juice before I even called for her. She sat with me while I drank it, waited 15 minutes, then had me test again. When it came back at 95, she made me a piece of toast with peanut butter. She didn't complain about being woken up. She didn't say I was being dramatic. She just took care of me like it was the most normal thing in the world. The next morning, Roland showed up at Gail's house with a thick folder and a tired look on his face. He sat at the kitchen table and spread out papers while Gail made coffee, and I tested my blood sugar at 142. Roland explained that CPS investigations take time, lots of time, and there wasn't any quick fix for my situation. He said they had to interview every family member separately, review all my medical records from the past 3 years, and build a solid case if they wanted to change my placement permanently. He showed me a timeline that stretched out for months with court dates and review meetings marked in red ink. I felt my stomach drop when I saw how long this would take, but Roland said rushing meant making mistakes that could send me back. 2 days later, the school counselor called Gail's house and said they needed to set up something called a 504 plan for my diabetes. We went to the meeting where the counselor had forms spread across her desk and a nurse sitting beside her taking notes. She explained I could test my blood sugar right in class without asking permission, keep juice boxes and snacks in my desk drawer, and leave for the nurse's office whenever I needed, without a hall pass. The nurse showed me where they'd keep extra supplies in her office and gave me a special medical alert bracelet with my name and condition on it. That same evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom's number, but it was Robert's way of typing with lots of spelling mistakes. He asked why I wasn't coming home and if I was mad at him because he told everyone I was sweaty at Christmas. My hands shook as I read it 3 times trying to figure out what to say. I wanted to protect him from knowing how bad things really were, but I also needed him to understand this wasn't his fault. I typed back that I was sick and doctors were helping me get better, that I loved him and would see him soon. He sent back a heart emoji and then nothing else. 2 weeks after leaving the hospital, I had to go back to the school and my stomach hurt the whole drive there. Walking through the front doors, I heard whispers starting immediately with some kids saying I faked being sick for attention, while others said they heard I almost died on Christmas morning. I kept my head up and walked to my locker without looking at anyone, pulling out my glucose meter right there in the hallway to test in front of everyone. My blood sugar was 95, and I made sure kids nearby could see the number on the screen. In math class, I tested again just to prove it was real, and by lunch, the whispers had mostly stopped. 3 days later, Roland picked me up from Gail's house to get some clothes and school stuff from my old house with a CPS worker there to supervise. Walking through that front door made my chest tight and my hands sweaty, but I focused on getting what I needed. Mom stood in the corner of my room not looking at me while I packed a duffel bag with jeans and shirts. Dad stayed downstairs muttering something about overreactions loud enough for us to hear, but the CPS worker's presence kept him from saying worse. I grabbed my science project from the desk and my lucky baseball cap from the closet, then walked out without saying goodbye. The next week, I had another appointment with the endocrinologist who pulled up all my test results on her computer screen. She showed me how my A1C was 11. 2, which meant my average blood sugar had been dangerously high for months, way above the 7.5 target for kids my age. She printed out graphs showing how my blood sugar logs were all over the place when they existed at all, with huge gaps where nobody had tested me for days. She typed up a detailed medical report right there in front of me, stating clearly that this represented medical neglect that could have killed me. She signed it and stamped it with the hospital seal, then made 3 copies for Roland's files. Roland called me a few days later to tell me about his interviews with my family members. He said Grandma Peef's influence over my parents were worse than he initially thought based on what everyone told him separately. She had convinced Mom and Dad that diabetes was made up by drug companies to sell medicine and that I was manipulating everyone for attention. He said Uncle Gus backed her up completely, and Aunt Daniela said I'd always been dramatic even before the adoption. Roland's voice got quiet when he said this helped our case because it showed a pattern of denial that put my life at risk. That evening at Gail's house, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started writing down everything I could remember about my medical care since the adoption. I stuck to just facts with dates when I could remember them, like the time Mom canceled my endocrinologist appointment because Livy had a play date. I wrote about Dad throwing away my glucose tablets because he said candy would rot my teeth. I listed every time they said I was faking or being dramatic when my blood sugar was actually low. By the time I finished, I had 6 pages of examples, and my hand was cramping, but having it all written down made me feel less crazy. 2 weeks later came the supervised visit with my adoptive parents at a neutral location downtown. Mom kept saying she was sorry, but couldn't have known I was really sick while tears ran down her face and messed up her makeup. Dad sat with his arms crossed, insisting they did their best with a difficult situation, and that nobody gave them a manual for dealing with special needs kids. The supervisor, a woman with gray hair and glasses, wrote notes on her clipboard when Mom slipped and said, maybe if they'd known more about my genetics, they could have handled things better. Dad added that my birth mother probably had the same issues, which is why I ended up in foster care. I wanted to scream, but kept my mouth shut and let them dig their own hole deeper. That night back at Gail's house, I was doing homework when I started feeling shaky and confused. I tested and my blood sugar had dropped to 50 without me noticing the warning signs because I was focused on my essay. Gail heard my meter beep and came immediately with glucose tablets, making me chew 4 while she set a timer for 15 minutes. We sat at the table while we waited, and she didn't say anything about being interrupted or me being careless. When the timer went off, I tested again at 95, and she made me a peanut butter sandwich with milk to keep my levels stable. No panic, no accusations, no drama, just calm medical care exactly like it should have always been. She even helped me finish my essay after, because my hands were still shaking too much to write clearly. The next morning at the school, the counselor called me to her office for the 5:04 meeting, and I sat at the big conference table with Roland, the principal, 2 teachers, and the school nurse all looking at me. I pulled out my list of what I needed and read it out loud, without looking up once. I needed to test my blood sugar whenever I felt low without asking permission. I needed to keep glucose tabs in my desk and my locker and my backpack. I needed to leave class immediately if my meter showed below 70. I needed extra time on tests if my blood sugar was off because high or low numbers made it hard to think straight. The counselor nodded at everything and wrote it all down on the official form, while the nurse added that I should also get bathroom passes without limits, since high blood sugar makes you pee a lot. The principal signed the papers right there and gave me copies to take home to Gail. Walking back to class, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, which was that adults were actually listening to me about my own body. During lunch, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't know, and when I opened it, there was a screenshot of the family group chat. Aunt Daniela had written that I probably learned to fake seizures from YouTube videos to get attention, and that the hospital was overreacting to normal teenage drama. Uncle Gus had replied saying I was always manipulative even as a little kid. Mom had added 3 crying emojis and said she didn't know what to do anymore. I forwarded the whole thing to Roland immediately, and he texted back within 5 minutes saying this was perfect evidence of ongoing denial, and he was adding it to the file. That afternoon, Roland called during study hall, and I went to the empty classroom next door to talk. He said CPS was escalating everything to family court because of the medical neglect, and that meant a real judge would decide where I lived from now on. My parents would have to prove they could keep me safe and healthy if they wanted me back. The court would look at all the evidence, including the 911 call, the hospital records, and now these text messages showing they still thought I was faking. He said the first hearing would be in about 6 weeks, and I'd have to testify about what happened on Christmas and all the times before when they were ignored my diabetes. My hands got sweaty just thinking about sitting in a courtroom, but Roland said Francesca would help me prepare. 2 days later, my phone lit up with a text from Dad's number saying I was destroying the family and needed to come home immediately and stop this nonsense before it went too far. He said I was being ungrateful after everything they'd done for me, and that real family doesn't involve the government in private matters. I took a screenshot before he could delete it and sent it straight to Roland, who called me 10 minutes later. He said Dad had violated the no-contact order since all communication was supposed to go through CPS, and he was filing a report with the court immediately. That weekend, Gail sat me down at the kitchen table with a food scale, measuring cups and a notebook. She showed me how to read nutrition labels and count the carbs in everything I ate. 15 grams of carbs in a slice of bread, 12 in a cup of milk, 20 in a small apple. She taught me the math for calculating my insulin doses based on my carb ratio, which was 1 unit for every 10 grams. We practiced with real meals, and she watched me do the math myself until I got it right every time. For the first time since my diagnosis, my blood sugar stayed between 80 and 150 all day, instead of bouncing from 40 to 400. The next week, the school counselor pulled me aside after the 5:04 meeting follow-up and handed me a blank journal. She said writing down how I felt physically and emotionally each day might help me see patterns. I thought it was stupid, but that night I wrote 3 sentences about feeling shaky at 3 p.m. and realized it happened every day when my lunch insulin peaked. The next day, I wrote about getting mad at a kid in math class and then checking my blood sugar to find it was 250. After a week, I could see that stress made my numbers go up, and exercise brought them down, and skipping snacks made me crash every single time. Then came the best day, when the endocrinologist called to say, insurance approved a continuous glucose monitor trial for 3 months. The medical supply company delivered it 2 days later, and the diabetes educator showed me how to insert the sensor into my arm with the spring-loaded applicator. It hurt for a second, then nothing, and suddenly my blood sugar number appeared on my phone screen, updating every 5 minutes. I could see the graph showing if I was going up or down or staying steady. I could set alarms for high and low numbers. I could finally see what my body was doing in real time instead of just random fingerstick snapshots. A month later, Mom requested a supervised visit, and we met at the CPS office with a social worker watching. She sat across from me and actually looked me in the eyes for the first time in months. She said she'd been scared that if I had medical problems, it meant she was a bad mother and couldn't handle it. She said Grandma Peef kept telling her diabetes was made up, and she wanted to believe it because the alternative was too scary. She said she was sorry. The social worker wrote everything down while I sat there trying to figure out if she meant it or if this was just what her lawyer told her to say. Roland called the next morning with huge news. He'd gotten the pharmacy records going back 2 years, and they showed my insulin prescriptions were filled late, or not at all, for 6 months straight. One prescription expired without ever being picked up. Another was filled 2 months late. The records proved they knew I needed medication and chose not to provide it, which was clear medical neglect. The judge would definitely want to see this evidence. That same week in English class, we got assigned to write about family traditions for the holidays, and I felt my chest get tight and my hands start shaking. The teacher was talking about Christmas memories and family recipes, and all I could think about was seizing on the floor while they said I was faking. I raised my hand and asked if I could do something different, and she said no, because everyone had to do the same assignment. At lunch, I went back and explained that Christmas was traumatic for me and asked if I could write about the science of diabetes instead. She thought about it and said I could do a presentation on how insulin works in the body, as long as I made it educational for the class. 3 days later, I came home from the school and found an envelope on the kitchen counter with my name written in crayon. Gail handed it to me and said it came from my old address. I opened it and pulled out a drawing of 2 stick figures holding game controllers with "Me and Herbert" written at the top in Robert's messy handwriting. My hands started shaking, and I had to sit down at the table. The drawing showed us sitting on the couch playing that racing game we always played together after school. He'd drawn little hearts around our heads and written, "I miss you," at the bottom. I pressed the paper against my chest and the tears just came. Gail rubbed my back while I cried and kept saying it was okay to miss him. I wanted to call him so bad, but I knew Mom would just hang up if she heard my voice. I put the drawing on my nightstand next to my glucose meter, where I could see it every morning. That same evening, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. Uncle Gus's voice filled my ear saying I was destroying the family with my lies, and if I didn't drop this whole thing, he'd make sure everyone at the school and church knew what a manipulative little faker I was. His voice got louder as he said no one would believe a word I said once he was done telling them the truth about me. I saved the message and called Roland right away. He listened to it twice and said this was witness intimidation, and we needed to file a police report immediately. He drove over that night, and we went to the police station together where an officer took my statement and made a copy of the voicemail. Roland added the police report number to my case file and said this would actually help show the pattern of the family trying to silence me. The next week, the endocrinologist called me into her office during my regular appointment. She had a typed document on official hospital letterhead that she read out loud to me. It stated that based on my A1C levels and blood sugar patterns from the past year, I would have died within 12 months without proper medical intervention. She explained how uncontrolled diabetes destroys your organs one by one until your body just shuts down. The statement said my glucose levels showed clear evidence of medical neglect that put me at immediate risk of diabetic coma, organ failure, and death. She signed it in front of me and had it notarized by the office manager. She made 3 copies and gave one to Roland for the case file. She looked me in the eyes and said, "No child should ever have to fight this hard just to stay alive." 2 weeks before the first court date, Roland introduced me to Francesca Woods, who would be my guardian ad litem. She explained her job was to represent what was best for me, not what my parents wanted or even what I wanted, but what would keep me safe and healthy. We met at the courthouse conference room, and she spread out all the documents from my case. She said the judge would ask me questions, and the most important thing was to stay calm and stick to facts. She taught me to take a breath before answering and to keep my answers short and simple. We practiced for 3 hours that first day. She pretended to be my parents' lawyer and asked me mean questions about lying for attention and making up symptoms. At first I got mad and wanted to argue, but she showed me how getting emotional made me look less believable. We did this twice a week for a month. She'd ask me the same questions different ways, trying to trip me up or make me angry. I learned to pause, count to 3 in my head, and answer with just the facts. When she asked if I was faking, I'd say my blood sugar was 38 and I had a seizure. When she asked if I just wanted attention, I'd say I wanted medical care for my diagnosed condition. She taught me not to use big words or long explanations because judges needed clear, simple answers. One afternoon, she brought in another lawyer to play the judge while she played the opposing counsel. They grilled me for 2 hours straight, and by the end, I could answer without my voice shaking or my hands getting sweaty. A week later, Francesca called to tell me a letter had arrived at the courthouse from our old church. The pastor wrote that I'd always been troubled and my parents were good Christian people trying their best with a difficult child. It felt like someone punched me in the stomach. Francesca said this was actually good for our case because it showed how the whole community enabled the neglect by believing I was the problem. She added it to our evidence file with a note about community pressure affecting my parents' medical decisions. Gail saw how upset I was getting with all the calls and messages from family members trying to guilt me into dropping the case. She made a new house rule that no one could contact me about anything legal except through official channels. She changed my phone number and set up call forwarding so only Roland, Francesca, and the court could reach me directly. She put a sign on the door saying no visitors without prior approval. Having that protection helped me focus on the school and managing my diabetes without people constantly trying to manipulate me. The school counselor worked with the nurse to set up a new system where I could test my blood sugar without everyone watching. They gave me a hall pass that let me go to the nurse's office between any classes without asking permission. The nurse kept my supplies in a special drawer, and I could slip in, test, treat, if needed, and get back to class in under 5 minutes. No more testing in front of everyone or having kids stare when I had to eat glucose tabs. At the pre-hearing conference, I sat between Roland and Francesca while the judge talked to all the lawyers. The court proposed that my parents complete diabetes education classes and continue supervised visits while the case moved forward. Mom's lawyer argued they should have unsupervised visits, but the judge said not until they proved they understood my medical needs. Francesca leaned over and whispered that this was actually good progress because it meant the court took the medical neglect seriously. My parents had to sign up for classes within 2 weeks or face contempt charges. That night, I sat at Gail's kitchen table and wrote a letter to Robert explaining my diabetes in words a 7-year-old could understand. I drew pictures of insulin as tiny helpers that let my body use food for energy. I explained that without my medicine, I got really sick really fast. I didn't mention Mom or Dad or the court case. I just wanted him to know that diabetes was real and not scary if you took care of it. I drew a picture of us playing video games at the bottom, just like his drawing. Gail mailed it the next morning. 3 days later, Francesca called to say the court date got pushed back. Dad's lawyer wanted more time to look at all my medical records from the past year. She said this was normal and actually better because it meant the judge would have everything when we finally got there. I tried not to feel disappointed, but I'd been counting down the days, and now I had to start over. The waiting made my stomach hurt all the time. 2 weeks passed before we got the new date, and in that time the judge signed something called an interim order. It basically said I had to stay with Gail until the case was done, and my parents had to take diabetes classes before they could see me without supervision. Roland brought me a copy and showed me where it said they had to complete at least 20 hours of education. The paper felt heavy in my hands like it actually meant something real. School got harder after that because everyone knew about the case now. Kids whispered when I walked by, and teachers gave me these sad looks that made me want to disappear. The stress made my blood sugar go crazy, and one day in math class, I felt that familiar shakiness starting. My CGM buzzed on my arm showing 70 and dropping. I pulled out my glucose tabs right there at my desk and ate 4 of them while everyone watched. The teacher stopped talking, but I just kept chewing and checking my phone app until the numbers started going back up. I felt proud that I caught it before it got bad. Nobody could say I was faking when they saw the actual numbers on my screen. A month into the case, my parents finished their first diabetes class, and Roland set up another supervised visit. We met at the same community center, but this time Dad actually asked to see my CGM. He looked at the graph on my phone and asked what the numbers meant. The supervisor wrote down that he showed appropriate concern about my medical needs. It wasn't much, but it was the first time he'd ever asked about my blood sugar without making it sound like I was lying. Mom sat there quietly and kept reaching for me, then pulling her hand back like she remembered she wasn't allowed to touch me without permission. The science fair came up in April, and I decided to use my CGM data for my project. I spent weeks making charts showing how different foods made my blood sugar spike or drop. I tracked what happened when I exercised versus sitting still. I even showed how stress from a test made my numbers go up even without eating anything. The judges seemed really interested and asked lots of questions about insulin and how the monitor worked. When they announced I got 3rd place, I almost cried. The ribbon was just cheap purple fabric, but it meant people saw me as smart instead of sick. Gail helped me frame it, and we hung it in my room next to my glucose log charts. In May, the court approved something new. They said my parents could have one unsupervised visit, but it had to be in public, and a nurse trained in diabetes had to be there. I felt sick thinking about being alone with them, even with a nurse watching. Francesca said I could say no if I wanted, but Roland thought it would show the judge I was trying. I finally agreed, but only for 2 hours at a restaurant where other people would be around. The day came, and we met at a pancake place downtown. The nurse sat at the next table pretending to read, but I could see her watching everything. Dad started out okay asking about school and my grades. Then he started talking about my birth mom again and how maybe diabetes ran in her family. The nurse stood up immediately and came over. She reminded him that discussing genetics wasn't appropriate and suggested we talk about something else. He got quiet after that, and we just ate our food. I ordered eggs and bacon because I knew exactly how many carbs were in them and how much insulin I needed. Mom watched me calculate my dose and test before eating. She didn't say anything, but she didn't tell me I was being dramatic either. Summer came, and Roland said CPS had been watching everything for 6 months now. They were starting to think about what they called reunification, but with really strict rules. He showed me a paper with all these conditions my parents would have to meet, like continuing therapy and keeping all my medical appointments and never leaving me alone with Grandma Peef. That last part made me feel better because she was the worst about saying diabetes was fake. Roland said I'd get to help decide if I felt safe going back. He promised nobody would force me if I didn't want to. The judge had already said Grandma Peef couldn't see me at all because of how she encouraged my parents not to treat my diabetes. It felt good knowing she couldn't fill their heads with her stupid ideas about kids these days being weak. The second big court date finally came in July. Everyone had to go to the courthouse, including Robert, who looked scared in his little suit. The judge read through 6 months of reports from supervisors and doctors in my school. She looked at my CGM data, showing how much better my control was now that I got proper care. Then she said I would stay with Gail through the whole school year. My parents had to keep doing family therapy and diabetes education. Robert had to go to special classes too, so he could understand what diabetes really was. The judge said we'd meet again in December to see if things had improved enough. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt tired, but also relieved. At least I knew where I'd be living and that my diabetes would be taken care of. That night at Gail's, I couldn't sleep thinking about living here until December, so I got up and started organizing all my diabetes stuff into one bag. I put glucose tablets in the front pocket and juice boxes in the side, and my meter in the middle part with extra test strips. I found an old backpack under the bed and transferred everything into it, along with glucagon shots and insulin pens and alcohol wipes. I wrote down Gail's number and Roland's number and the endocrinologist's number on 3 different cards and put them in different pockets. I added a laminated card with my diagnosis and medication list that the hospital gave me. The bag felt heavy, but having everything in one place where I could grab it made my chest stop feeling so tight. I kept it next to my bed that night and every night after, taking it to the school and to visits and everywhere because nobody could stop me from carrying my own medical supplies anymore. The next Monday, the school counselor called me to her office and spread out all my missing assignments from when I was in the hospital. She had gotten every teacher to break down the work into smaller pieces with new due dates written on sticky notes. We went through each subject, and she showed me which assignments I could skip and which ones I actually needed to do to pass. She set up a schedule where I could work in the library during lunch to catch up without missing more class. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she checked my progress and helped me with the harder stuff like the science project I missed. It took 6 weeks, but I turned in every single assignment, and my grades went from failing to B's, and even an A in math. The report cards went to CPS, and Roland put them in my file as proof I wasn't the troubled kid my family kept saying I was. In August, Robert started going to a special class at the hospital for kids who have family members with diabetes. Roland told me about it during our monthly meeting and showed me the workbook they gave Robert with pictures of the pancreas and insulin molecules. Robert learned how to count carbs and what happens when blood sugar goes too low or too high. The instructor taught him how to recognize symptoms and what to do in emergencies. He made a poster about diabetes for his summer day camp and won a prize for it. Roland said Robert kept asking questions about why diabetes happens and if it was his fault I got sick. The teacher explained it was nobody's fault and that some people just need extra help to stay healthy. When Roland showed me a picture Robert drew of us playing video games with my glucose monitor on the table between us, I had to look away so he wouldn't see my eyes get watery. September brought a thick envelope from CPS with Mom's handwriting on the front. Inside was a 3-page letter where she wrote about failing to protect me and causing real harm by not managing my diabetes. She listed specific times she should have let me test my blood sugar or get food when I needed it. She wrote about listening to Grandma Peef instead of doctors and choosing to believe I was faking instead of seeing I was really sick. The last paragraph said she understood if I never forgave her, but she wanted me to know she was sorry and was learning how wrong she had been. Roland said she had to write it as part of her education program, but nobody made her write 3 pages when 1 would have been enough. I kept the letter in my folder with my hospital bracelet because even though it didn't fix anything, she finally admitted what really happened. The supervised visits with Dad changed too after the July court date. He showed up exactly on time for every single one and followed all the rules the supervisor set. He stopped mentioning my birth mom or genetics completely and only asked about school and my blood sugar levels. When I tested during visits, he watched quietly without commenting. When I needed to eat a snack for low blood sugar, he waited without complaining about the schedule. The supervisor documented every visit showing Dad was complying with court orders, even if it felt forced and uncomfortable. Roland said the judge needed to see consistent behavior change over time, and Dad was providing exactly what the court required. In October, Roland sat down with me and Gail to explain what would happen next. He pulled out a timeline showing I would stay with Gail for 3 more months until January, with slowly increasing family contact if everything went well. There would be 2 unsupervised visits in November and 3 in December, all in public places with clear safety plans. My parents would keep going to therapy and diabetes education, and Robert would continue his classes too. The judge would review everything in January to decide if I could go home with strict monitoring or if I needed to stay in foster care longer. Roland said I would have input in the decision, and nobody would force me to go back if I didn't feel safe. The plan had pages of requirements my parents had to meet and consequences if they messed up even once. That same week, I went through the box of stuff from the hospital and pulled out my adoption certificate and the plastic hospital bracelet from Christmas. I put them in a blue folder along with Mom's apology letter and my glucose logs from the past months and the court orders keeping me safe. Looking at those papers reminded me I was both things at once: the adopted kid they almost let die and the survivor who fought to stay alive. Thanks for letting me share these observations with you today. I appreciate our time together exploring this journey. Until we meet again, like the video, it helps more than you think.